Thank you for coming to this session. We're really excited to be able to hear from Brother Rennaker today. It will be my privilege to introduce him to you, and then we'll just spend the time with him for his presentation. Jacob Rennaker received his bachelor's degree in Ancient and Near Eastern Studies from BYU, after which he completed a master's degree in Comparative Religion at the University of Washington. Today, Jacob is a PhD candidate in Hebrew Bible at Claremont Graduate University, and is completing work on his dissertation, which deals with temples in ancient Israel, Babylon, and John Milton's Paradise Lost. He is happily married to the brilliant and talented Anna Dames, and is the proud teacher of 44 exceptional students.
Okay, well, I am going to be talking about something very specific, which is Ezekiel's temple. And there are a few different reasons why I think this sort of approach is valuable in understanding temples in general. First of which is familiarity breeds laziness. Because we talk about the temple so much in our conversation as Latter-day Saints, sometimes it's easy to take it for granted. And so because we're discussing it so much and we're participating in it so much, sometimes it's difficult to appreciate what we really do have, as well as what different prophets and other people in the scriptures are trying to tell us about temples, unique messages that they might have that might just go over our heads because we're not really thinking specifically about those, or what things this author has to contribute that is unique. So my approach is going to be very specific. Oftentimes when we talk about temples, it's kind of in broad terms, assuming that all temples across time and eternity are exactly the same. But when you look at these temple texts, the authors are trying to do different things. They're trying to emphasize different points for different purposes. And so I want to look at Ezekiel, try to take Ezekiel at his own terms and try to understand what messages Ezekiel might be trying to portray to us about the temple that he was familiar with. And so to do that, we're going to have to look at the context of Ezekiel personally, where he was when he is writing about the temple, and hopefully that gives us some information to work with as far as how to understand Ezekiel's temple on his terms. So first off, who was Ezekiel? Ezekiel was in an interesting position. He was a prophet, but also he was a priest. And so this affects how he describes the temple itself, having lived as a priest to some extent. He would have been familiar with priestly ways of talking about the temple and talking about God as well. And because priests were so involved in temple services, they have a different perspective than other Israelites who wouldn't have been as familiar with the temple, only visiting every so often. So Ezekiel, when he actually is writing about the temple we're going to be talking about, he is in exile. So he starts out in Israel, but then he is deported and is in Babylon. And so what we're going to be talking about is Ezekiel's vision that he receives while he is in Babylon. And this vision, this is in chapters 40 to 48 of the book of Ezekiel, and it's really complicated and really mysterious because Ezekiel doesn't tell us exactly what is happening. The book of Ezekiel itself actually almost didn't make it into the Bible, along with the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. These are two books that some of the Jews were really iffy about and what their purpose was. The reason why this one didn't quite make it in was because the temple that's described here is slightly different. Some of the dimensions and the rituals that are performed in the temple that Ezekiel describes in this vision are different from the other temple that the Jews were familiar with. So the question is, what is Ezekiel seeing? So he says he sees this in a vision. We don't know if that was a vision of the previous temple that he would have been familiar with before he was exiled. We don't know. It could possibly be a heavenly blueprint, similar to the sort of blueprint that was shown to Moses and to David, or if this is a future temple, if he's seeing something in the future, or even if he's seeing the heavenly temple, if he's seeing God's temple in heaven, Ezekiel never tells us. So we really don't know. All we know is that Ezekiel sees a vision of a temple, and we're left to wrestle with the question of what is this and what does it mean? And so hopefully we'll be able to do a little bit of wrestling here in the next few minutes. So a number of scholars have approached Ezekiel, this temple, because it is kind of mysterious and not well defined as far as what it is, what exactly he's seeing. And so scholars in approaching the book of Ezekiel, this temple vision within it, have taken a few different approaches. They recognize that the subject of sacred space is very important for Ezekiel. And having recognized that, though, there's disagreement upon how does this sacred space function. And the real question is, how does one approach God in the temple? What's the correct way? What's the primary message that Ezekiel's trying to teach us about approaching God in the temple? So the two of the most basic and primary views that scholars have taken are a vertical approach to sacred space and a horizontal approach to sacred space. And so with that, the vertical approach, it emphasizes an ascent towards where God is situated, some holy mountain or elevated area. And from these studies that scholars have done, the altar is the focus. So where the sacrifices are being offered, and that's kind of the meeting place between God and Israel. And scholars who emphasize this view are also emphasizing the context of Ezekiel being in Babylon, and kind of draw from some of the images that Ezekiel would have been surrounded with to kind of support this idea of an ascent to reach God through the temple. The other approach is a horizontal approach, moving from east then to west, and moving horizontally through sacred space, increasingly sacred space, to actually approach God in the temple. And scholars that do this are focusing on priestly imagery, imagery from, we'll actually talk about what that means by priestly imagery. Just kind of an overview, we're going to be talking about two different approaches: vertical ascent to holy space, and versus kind of this horizontal approach to sacred space. So first, the vertical ascent to sacred space. One of the things that kind of signals that Ezekiel is seeing an ascent imagery are the stairs here. And if you notice, here's a little diagram of Ezekiel's temple, and you see these little line structures. Those are stairs. And so you have a few different sets of stairs that you have to climb, and then climb again to get to the altar, or climb again to get into the sanctuary proper, where you have the holy place and the holy of holies. So stairs, the fact that Ezekiel, when he's starting out this vision, he's actually being guided by an angel. So this angel has this nice little tour guide with him that's taking him around this temple building, and Ezekiel's kind of measuring, trying to make sense of the temple himself. So there's an emphasis in the text on all of these steps that he keeps climbing. One scholar noted that, quote, "The difference in elevation increases with each unit as the sacred complex, in the sacred complex, as one moves from the outside towards the center. The scene is impressive. The observer's eyes are drawn ever upward to the top of this temple mount." So stairs ascending, they're continually kind of climbing, and so the gaze of the person that's climbing it are kind of focused upward. And at the top, what they get to is the altar. And so here's kind of a reconstruction of what that might possibly look like. You see, the steps, one's being raised, and then another set of steps, creating a difference in height. But you also have, if you look at it from the top, the way scholars usually trying to map this area, you see they put the altar directly in the middle. So your eye, when you're looking at the temple, it kind of zeroes in on the very middle there, in that altar. And so they argue that when you're crossing all of these, and here's in a stairway, another stairway, so you're coming in all these angles, and then you end up here at the altar. So scholars take this view, look at the altar as kind of being the center and the focus of approaching God and being able to actually somehow attain the presence of God to the extent possible when you're offering sacrifices. Also, you have the language that's used here describing this altar itself, and on the face of it, it's not incredibly impressive. But again, looking at things in context and carefully, there's some very interesting things that Ezekiel is doing here in describing the altar. So in English, here's the description of the altar that we see. It says, "And these are the measures of the altar after the cubits. From the bottom upon the ground," so the base of the altar, "even to the lower settle shall be 2 cubits. The breadth 1 cubit, the lesser settle and the greater settle shall be 4 cubits, breadth 1 cubit." Not incredibly excited, right? "Then so the altar shall be 4 cubits. From the altar upward shall be 4 horns." So this is the description. In English, nothing to see here, right? And we'll move along. But when you look at it in Hebrew, and you recognize the language that Ezekiel is using, here's what happens. So first, the phrase that he uses to describe the bottom of the altar, that's translated in the King James Version as the bottom upon the ground, is Hek Haaretz, which literally means the bosom of the earth, or the underworld, netherworld, kind of the lowest conceivable part of existence in the universe. And then, when it describes the altar upward, this term specifically for the altar, Har El, it's unique here, and it can be translated to the mountain of God, which then is equivalent with the heavens. So here, in just his description, the language that he's using, he's alluding to this altar that from the bottom is starting at the bosom of the earth, the underworld, and then the top of it reaches to the heavens. So this kind of goes along with Mesopotamian and ancient Near Eastern ideas of what the universe was like. So we have, when we picture the universe, we have our sun in the center, we can draw some rings around that, and then that's circling something else longer and wider and more expansive. But for ancient Israelites and Mesopotamians, you have this idea of the heavens. You have the underworld kind of below the earth. You have the earth, the area that you're existing on, and then you have the heavens above you. So it kind of neatly divides up into these 3 sections of the heaven, the earth, and what's underneath the earth there. So again, Ezekiel is using very specific and nuanced language that's easy to overlook if you're just breezing right through these not too terribly engaging descriptions of distances and heights to reconstruct this altar. So the altar itself, if you kind of look at it, you see there's kind of 3 tiers of the altar there with the horns on top. That corresponds very nicely to these different levels of the temple. You have one level up there, then going up to another level, and then going up to the sanctuary, the holy place and holy of holies. So the altar itself is kind of a little miniature of the temple itself. One scholar notes that from this actual axial point of the altar, the new temple, like the old, will be a font of blessing for Israel, a mountain of God linking the highest heaven to the nethermost earth. So, from this way of looking at things, the altar itself serves to link creation, everything that's below and that which is above, and in a larger scale, then the temple itself does the same thing. It's connecting earth beneath with heaven above. All that is meeting there on the temple in general, and kind of the altar in particular. And this coincides nicely with Mesopotamian imagery of ascent and how they looked at approaching a god. So here in this cylinder seal, here you have the sun god, the Mesopotamian sun god, who's climbing a set of kind of stairs that possibly could be a temple there, and then is approaching the god of wisdom here on his throne. So there's this idea in Mesopotamian iconography, this ascent going up towards God, and changing your elevation. So with temples themselves, you have similarities between the altar that we saw before with the horns on, right? Multi-level, that's probably the wrong term, multi-tiered. Don't want anybody to get excited. Multi-tiered altar that's building upon itself to a sacred top with horns on it. So if you look at here, it's called a ziggurat. It's kind of this stepped pyramid-like structure that was part of the Mesopotamian temple kind of complex there. And if you look closely there, you can see kind of little horns up on the top. So this is part of their temple imagery, these stepped buildings with horns on the top, and that's the same sort of imagery that we see in Ezekiel, not just with climbing steps and ascending to the throne of the God, the Israelite God there in the Holy of Holies, and also, as I mentioned earlier, the horns, the different levels, kind of corresponding nicely there. And again, all of those are evocative of this conception of the universe, these different levels of the world and how they're connected together. And so, what you have here, one of the scholars says that the temple is the epitome of the world, a concentrated form of its essence, a miniature of the cosmos. So it's kind of a little mini universe, if you will. The altar itself and the temple is kind of serving to encapsulate and represent the entire cosmos. The heaven, the earth, everything under the earth, and all in between is kind of represented in this compact, holy structure of the temple itself. And so you have this imagery is mentioned by a number of different Mesopotamian authors, including kings, who are describing the work that they're doing in building these temples and what they're doing. One of them, king of Assyria, says, when he's talking about his project of building up temples, he says, "I raised the top of the temple to heaven. Above to heaven I elevated its top. Below in the netherworld I made firm its foundation." So from his perspective, the temple is, again, serving to connect the heavens above, earth beneath, and everything. It's connecting. It's this holy center that reality and existence is kind of centered around and representative of. So these are the kind of imagery and arguments that are used for suggesting that Ezekiel, in describing the temple, wants us to think about climbing and ascending to reach God. That's how you approach God, is by climbing. The other perspective that I mentioned at the beginning is the horizontal approach, moving progressively from one end to another to more sacred and holier space. And this is, and scholars that look to these say that Ezekiel is a priest, and so he is using priestly imagery, and this kind of aligns with that. So priestly imagery are things, the type of writing that you would find in Leviticus. For example, rules, regulations, divisions about how to proceed religiously. That's kind of priestly imagery. You see that same sort of thing in Genesis chapter 1 with the marking of days, day 1, day 2, day 3, and you have dividing of light, dark, water, so an emphasis on divisions, putting everything in their proper place and organizing things. So that's what the scholars, when they refer to priestly imagery, that's the sort of thing that they're referring to. And you can see that in the layout of the temple that you have here. So you have the number of stairways and gates. These are these gates here. They have a kind of three-part structure to them that you kind of walk through. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those gates, similar to the days of creation, right? 6 days of creation that then culminates in the 7th day, this kind of extra special sacred space and time. The Sabbath day, if you look there, you have this three-part, 1, 2, 3 of the sanctuary building, where you have the holy place and then the Holy of Holies there, and that's the outer court. So this also has kind of a three-part division like each of these gates does. And so as you're kind of going along, you are falling into this rhythm, and you have a number of gates. Ezekiel goes through and sees each of the 6 gates, and then the angel, when he actually takes him through, he doesn't stop at the altar. He goes right past the altar without actually saying anything, and then sneaks into this sanctuary building itself. So one scholar notes that Ezekiel's tour, remember, he's being taken along by an angel. This tour has as its goal not at the altar, but in the temple building to the west of the altar, and there in that most westerly room of that building, the Holy of Holies. So this scholar is arguing for is that this kind of center isn't what's most important, isn't the most sacred, but the emphasis is placed that Ezekiel being led by the angel through these different gates. This is the emphasis here. It's something that's off-center. It's something that you have to move towards, off to the side. And that's what makes it holy and unique. You also have Garden of Eden imagery that coincides nicely with some of this priestly view of reality and how humanity and God interact. So Garden of Eden imagery actually shows up elsewhere in Ezekiel. You have Tyre is equated with Eden, the Garden of God in chapter 28. There's also some other really interesting things happening there in chapter 28. We don't have time to go into those. But then elsewhere, Assyria, Egypt, and other unnamed nations are described as being trees of Eden that are planted in the Garden of God. So there's a build-up to this Eden imagery that then is realized in this final temple vision that Ezekiel has. For instance, chapters 40 and 42 is when Ezekiel's being led around by the angel. And one of the first things that he notices, that he remarks, is that in each of these 6 gates, he sees palm trees. So on the carved on the side of these are palm trees. So it's kind of garden imagery. But then, as he gets to the sanctuary building, there are not only palm trees, but you also have cherubim. So that's some sort of angelic, heavenly figure that's also carved on the walls there. But then, not only that, you have these same images of the palm trees and cherubim on the doors. So if you look closely there, you can see there's kind of little winged creatures with trees on them. This is actually a reconstruction of Solomon's temple, but that's the idea of what you have. So you have the walls being carved, Ezekiel's seeing walls around here carved with palm trees and cherubim, the same thing here, as well as the doors themselves. So everything's covered in this imagery that you see in the Garden of Eden. So, going to the Genesis account, Genesis chapter 3, you have verse 24, Adam's being expelled from the garden, right? It says, when God drove out the man, he placed on the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim right there, and flaming sword, nicely depicted there, continually turning to guard the way to the tree of life. So, here's the cherubim, and there are the trees up there. So, Adam then is driven out in an eastward direction, right? So the cherubim are placed at the east end, right, the east of the Garden of Eden, so on the east end. Adam's expelled there, and the cherubim are placed there to prevent a westward approach to this sacred space, where they have the mountain of the Lord and the tree of life, right? So the fact that you have cherubim guarding the way to the tree indicates that that direction is sacred. They don't have the cherubim placed elsewhere. The emphasis is on the east. You can't make a westward return to the presence of God. And again, that's something that you see there on the doors, these initial doors here, as well as the doors that are going into the Holy of Holies itself. So you have to pass through and pass these cherubim to get back to the presence of God. And something else that's often overlooked is Garden of Eden imagery in the sense of the names that are used for Ezekiel. When God's speaking to Ezekiel, he typically calls him Son of Man, in Hebrew, Ben Adam. Now, this term is used frequently, but most frequently in, well, pretty much the bulk of it. 90 out of 107 times that it's used, the term Son of Man, in the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament. 93 of those are in Ezekiel. And then there's 14 others spread somewhere else with the entire Old Testament. So this is obviously something that is of concern for Ezekiel. This is how he understands his relationship to God, is Son of Man. Now, it's also possible to translate that term as Son of Adam. So the generic name for humanity and Adam's name are the same. in Hebrew. So it's possible to translate that as son of Adam. And here's why that's significant. One scholar states that later texts of the Second Temple period, so this is when the Jews are coming back from exile and rebuilding the temple, the Second Temple. Later texts of this period note that the priest in the temple represents Adam in the Garden of Eden, which may explain the appellation Ben Adam, or son of Adam, or mortal, that is consistently applied by Jehovah to Ezekiel throughout the book. The fact that only the high priest may enter the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is guarded by cherubim, much like the Garden of Eden, reinforces this image. So here's the picture that we have. You have, again, cherubim placed here on the east end, guarding the way back to a westward return to Tree of Life. Now, in the Israelite tabernacle and temple, you have the same sort of layout. So you have, here in the east, a westward return. You have to pass through the cherubim, pass a little tree there, and the altar, and then more cherubim, and then you're in the Holy of Holies. So, in a sense, the priest can be seen as representing Adam, right? Kind of the replacement for Adam. Adam was expelled eastward from the Garden of Eden. Then you have the priest kind of making up for that and returning back to the presence of God in the Holy of Holies. But again, a kind of westward return to the presence of God. And this sort of imagery was especially significant, not just for Ezekiel personally, but also for all of those who had been taken to Babylon in exile. So another scholar states that Ezekiel's stress on Eden traditions in his description of Zion is a way of reorienting the hopes of his audience from the east, where Eden had thought to lie, to the west, the direction of Israel's future. So, in kind of a metaphorical sense, right, Israel has been removed from their temple in the presence of God and has been taken out eastward. And now, Ezekiel is trying to point them back towards the presence of God, their land of inheritance. And so the exiles, like Adam, are then having to turn westward and return geographically to the presence of God where their inheritance was. So both of these vertical and horizontal approaches are legitimate approaches, right? You can see how Ezekiel would want us to understand the kind of upward, vertical nature of approaching God. You can also see how kind of moving westward is something that Ezekiel is focusing on and would have resonated to him. So you have these two different approaches, and for scholars, they assume that one of those two has to be correct, that it's either this kind of ascent or it's a movement. And generally that's so you have both of these views that look pretty good, but they don't see them as being able to be reconciled together. So to do that, to provide a sort of reconciliation, there's a model that I think is really helpful for understanding how both of these views can work together. And possibly for Ezekiel as the author who's crafting this story, how he could do this in a way that included both vertical and horizontal, and both of those are good ways of understanding in the ways that he sees as being significant. And that's through a particular Mesopotamian statue. This is called a lamassu. Here's a little picture of it there. So see you have different types of feet here, bowls, sometimes lion feet, and then you have a nice little crown. There are horns representing divinity, and then you have person's face, and there's wings tucked in there. And you kind of see the wing, the little feathers carved in there. But these were stationed at, oftentimes, in front of temples as kind of protective spirits. They're actually referred to as the protective spirit of the temple. They're sometimes also put before kings' throne rooms also, but especially in front of temples as kind of guards. And so there's similarities between this and the cherubim guarding the way back to the sacred space of Eden. But that's not what I want us to focus on. I want us to focus on the way that the sculptors portrayed this particular creature. So I'm going to read you a little something from a art historian that's discussing how this statue was created, what it was meant to portray. So she says, if one looks at one of these monsters from one side, you see that it has 4 legs striding purposefully forward. So here's the front approach. You see the 2 legs there, and it's fine. You go to the side approach, looking at it from the side, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 legs, right? It looks complete. Everything's fine here. But then, let's see, one moves head on from the front. It has 2 legs, with 2 front legs at rest, like we see up there. Both views in isolation are satisfactory and logical, as the figures might have been drawn by an artist looking at it either from one direction or from the other. The three-quarter viewpoint, in contrast, with both front and side visible at once, show an animal that has not 4 legs, but 5. Okay, so if you count to be a little unknown animal husband, what's the correct term for, I'm not a geneticist either, or a vocabulary, I guess. So here's you have 5 legs, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You see all 5 legs, right? So from either one of these 2 directions, it's fine, right? Looks good, but when you're at this 3/4 viewpoint, you're off-centered, then you see that there are actually 5 legs. And that's a bit off, right? At least from my experience with limited experience with animals. So what I would, this sort of paradigm, this way of looking at actually helps us understand how both of these views that Ezekiel is expressing in the text are actually legitimate and make sense and actually can work together. So the tension between these 2 views, either vertical ascent to God or a horizontal approach, are like being distracted by the strangeness of being at the 3/4 viewpoint and noticing all 5 legs that something is off. Both views work when viewed in isolation, but if you assume that only one of the 2 could be correct, that's when you were hit with the confusion like you have here with the 5-legged animal. So both of these approaches, so what I'm arguing is that for Ezekiel, I'm saying if you were to ask Ezekiel, which one is it? Is it vertical? Is it horizontal? Ezekiel would say yes. And that's because both of these 2 work, and they work together, and don't have to be at odds, as they often are in scholarly writings. So we have conclusion. A few things here. So Ezekiel's temple, the way that it's set up, and even previous writings of Ezekiel, kind of challenge an either-or paradigm for understanding things. You have, like here's a picture, William Blake painting of the angels that Ezekiel sees with 4 different faces, 4 wheels facing 4 different directions at the same time. It's not neat, clean, and tidy as we would like it to be. So Ezekiel's temple, in describing this, it's complicated. You have to really wrestle with it. And I think that's some of what the beauty of studying Ezekiel by himself does, is it helps you appreciate the sort of complex imagery and language that he's using that you wouldn't have if you just lumped it in with the rest of the temples that are described. So there's something special and something that you get out of only reading Ezekiel that you don't get if you read them all together. Another thing that I think this sort of exercise does is helps us understand contradictions elsewhere, say in our own gospel study, or studies in general. And so Joseph Smith, picture of Joseph there, he once said, "It is by proving contraries that truth is made manifest." So sometimes when we dig down and really study things, sometimes we have things come up that we didn't notice before that might seem contradictory. But what I believe Joseph is suggesting there is we shouldn't run from seemingly contradictory information as we're trying to learn and grow, but rather we should hit that head on, wrestle with it, and it's in the interaction of that then we actually learn, grow ourselves, and can progress to become more like God. That's that idea of opposition in all things, having 2 things that are opposite each other, and it's navigating between those and seeing the interaction that helps us to actually understand reality itself and our place in the universe. More conclusions. So biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholarship are invaluable for understanding temples. Not just ancient temples, but also understanding our own temple traditions. So in turning to biblical scholarship, non-LDS biblical scholarship, and even non-biblical, non-LDS scholarship about temples, we are provided with a wealth of alternative approaches, tools that we can use to then incorporate and understand our own temple experience. And I think, in a sense, I mentioned at the beginning that familiarity breeds laziness. Oftentimes we just go back, have the same sort of temple experience. That looking at some of these different descriptions of temples, and even temples in other cultures, can help us recognize more clearly what we have, and it, in a sense, breathes new life into our temple worship. It can, I know it definitely has for me, myself. And so, one of the approaches that this kind of introduces is this idea of sacred space and sacred direction within temple worship. So, for example, one of the things that we have in Latter-day Saint temples is you have changes in elevation as you progress through the temple itself. And so this issue of sacred height, right, ascent, it's an element, it's a way that we can look at temples and understand it. So it's a question to have you consider yourselves, that anybody can consider after using this sort of approach to understand Ezekiel's temple is, how would Latter-day Saints describe their approach to God in the temple? Would it be ascent? Is it moving towards a direction, a combination of the two? Is it the same in every temple? That's something that would be valuable for everybody to actually think about as they're going through the temple experience themselves. Another one from this discussion we just had is the Garden of Eden imagery that appears that's emphasized in Ezekiel's account that we would do well to consider in our own temple tradition, right? So Garden of Eden imagery is everywhere. It's there architecturally, theologically. It's really rich. It's there. So what sort of role is that playing? Why is this sort of imagery being used? Why not another story? What is it about Eden? And what is it about us and our involvement with that? All sorts of questions that you can ask, again, that you're more sensitive to if you're looking at these more detailed studies, like the studying Ezekiel's temple vision and his description of it. And finally, just in general, one of the things that doing this has helped me to do is to recognize how much I don't know. So when you kind of dig into these individual approaches, looking at individual passages of Scripture, you recognize you really don't understand everything that's going on. And so it requires humility. If you're going to learn anything, you have to be humble. You have to recognize what you know and how you actually know it before you can then kind of learn more. You have to really take a conscious look at how you understand things, how they fit together, and how you even arrive at that. And so in engaging with this different scholarship about temples, that's one thing that it does kind of challenges, okay, that doesn't seem familiar, or I like this, but how do I know this? These questions come up, and it requires humility as we open ourselves up to the possibility of actually accepting, receiving more knowledge from either academic sources or spiritual sources. All of those requires humility. Also, willingness to learn from others. So biblical scholarship is fantastic. People have been doing it for a very long time, and they've already invented the wheel. They've invented a few different wheels. And so these are ready-made ideas that we can go to learn from, to help us understand the world of the Bible, to understand temples in general. That's just like it's a wealth of information that we can just go to as soon as we'd like to. There's a great library here just across the campus there. And there's all sorts of books on this that you can check out and read more and learn from people, not just Latter-day Saint authors, but there's this value in looking at other people, other approaches, people that are working on these same sort of questions. And so kind of in closing then, I think in incorporating all this different information, looking at all of the different biblical information, looking at ancient Near Eastern and other traditions, one of the things that we can do from that is then gather in truth. And I love this quote from Joseph Smith. He says, "One of the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism is to receive truth, let it come from where it may." That's what Joseph did, was he was hungry. And he tried gathering in as much truth as he possibly could from wherever he could get it. And that's the same sort of thing that we can do, and that can help enrich specifically, not just our spiritual life, but also our temple experience in general. So I encourage, I recognize that in my own personal worship and engaging with this sort of study, that I have been incredibly enriched, and my brain refuses to shut off during the temple ceremonies, and I love it. And I can testify that this is very valuable, that the temples are significant, and there are so many more things that we can do to learn and understand the importance of temples. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming and attending this session. We do have one more session for this afternoon in this room and other rooms here in the Benson Building, the Marr Building, and the Joseph Smith Building. So,
Do you have a few minutes for questions?
oh, of course, certainly. Yeah.
What time actually was just very quick.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions.
If anybody is daring enough to ask questions, yeah.
So Ezekiel's temple vision involves the sacrifice of animals.
Right.
It's really an Old Testament type of temple in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it was never built. And we are past the Old Testament. We have a New Testament now. So is there a future temple? Does Ezekiel give us any clues, or is he the one who would say, the Old Testament is a millennial, is a heaven, and he would say yes?
It does. And that's what there's all sorts of arguments that happen between scholars. Like, what is it? Is it supposed to be like some restoration future temple that will be built, or is it just this really good, like the ideal temple, kind of this Platonic ideal temple that exists in heaven that he then sees? There really isn't. People go back and forth on that all the time. There's absolutely no consensus on what Ezekiel is saying. So he might. So there's a very real possibility that he would say yes. And yes, right? So good, excellent question. Anybody else? Yeah.
So I'm just trying to think about the two ascents that you were the vertical, horizontal. Obviously, one ends and focuses at the altar, the other one focuses in the holy of holies of the temple. And coming from the Egyptian point of view, they have on their ascent to the sky, there's two ways, right? There's an initial path you take, and then after you take that path, there's a second path you take. And so I'm wondering if the initial ascent would be more akin to the world's ascent to the altar. In other words, this initial coming to God, where you come and you enter into that courtyard and you sacrifice and you are washed. Okay. Then the second path is actually the path of one who's already initiated to further, enter into the presence of God. And so kind of looking at it maybe that way,
That's another. I think I really like that because there's the emphasis on both of those in this text, and so I think that's a great way if you're looking at like a twofold sort of ascent process.
Yeah, and just to throw this into a performing context, I think that at least I'm becoming more and more convinced that the story of Lehi is actually that first path. As they arrive at the tree and partake, but then they have to be tested to see if they're going to fall away from that tree. He's given us a vision of that first path. It's the world, right, who's leading and pressing forward to get to that tree. So that would be like the first, pressing forward to the altar, and the water. Then, the rest of the story he doesn't tell, which is ascending and actually partaking of the tree of life for real. They're pointing the presence of God.
Interesting. I really like that, and I think there's definitely Eden imagery there, right? The tree of life in the history. So I think that's definitely worth considering. So good, excellent. Thanks for that.
Thank you, David. That's a great presentation. I think as sort of Christians, when we substitute the altar for Christ, I think a lot of this suddenly, the ascent and then the return back into the garden, as it were, or entering into the presence of the Lord, sort of makes sense. Because we're ascending to Christ, and then Christ, it's from the altar that we then return, it's from Christ, from that sort of return back to Christ that we're then able to proceed to the next level.
Good. I really like that. It's a fantastic observation. I think that's definitely something that Christianity adds to that. About like Christ as being kind of the central focus, but it doesn't just stop at Christ. He then escorts us into the presence of God. Fantastic. Really like that. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's pretty clear that he's describing an archetypal template, I guess, of a temple?
Oh, yeah.
And so,
Possibly.
but is it original, or have they been doing this in practice since way before, like the Egyptian temples, and I've been through temples in India, for example, where that basic construction goes back to probably the time of Christ and things like that. And I wonder if it's something that was somewhat understood by the Israelites, and he put those principles in there. And I don't know where in history does it fit, do you think?
So Ezekiel is during the time of the Babylonian exile. So Ezekiel was familiar. The first 11, 12 chapters of Ezekiel, it's taking place in Jerusalem, and you have chapters that are very detailed going through the Jerusalem temple. And Ezekiel is seeing a vision of all the terrible things that are happening in the temple, and why God then gets up and leaves. It wasn't that God was defeated in that temple, it was that the Israelites were messing up. And so God had to then remove God's self from the temple. And so contextually and historically, Ezekiel's coming from this temple, this abused temple, but a temple that he was familiar with. And so it's very similar. Well, we don't know.
So sort of setting the record straight?
Possibly, it could be doing that. But again, Ezekiel never tells us. So your guess is good or better than mine. I hate to shatter your, that might be a great compliment to you, by the way. So keep thinking, maybe write something on this. Thanks. Good question. Anything else to add?
The Dead Sea Scroll temple plan, how does that compare to Ezekiel's? Have you studied?
That is a great question. I haven't looked detail. Jeff, have you looked at any compared like dimensions? I'm not sure. I want to say it's even different. I want to say that it's much larger, but I'm not 100% sure. I haven't looked at that. That's a great question. Thank you. One last question.
So is Ezekiel trying to teach us how the temple functions, how it is constructed, or how we worship in it?
I'd say it's Jeff.
Or is he giving hope to those who've seen their temple destroyed that in some sense God will return? I mean, in the broader sense of the question.
There's another, so contextually speaking, he is prophesying to a people who are in Babylon at the time. So at the very least, like Levinson said, he's kind of reorienting them. He's giving them hope that, okay, we had this temple, we can salvage this, God is still here, God is still revealing things to me. So at the very least, you have that. But like I said earlier, the book of Ezekiel has some differences between the way that sacrifice and ritual was described in Leviticus. And so we don't know exactly what's happening. Is it a correction of that? Is it the ideal of what's supposed to be happening? Is it Ezekiel's best recollection of that way of articulating it? We don't know. And that's why I love this text so much. Because I just keep finding more and more questions about it. So, great question.